Moving on to our next starred slide, this is Jan van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece. We're looking at one of those polyptychs, or many-winged altarpieces, would have sat behind the pulpit in a Catholic church. This one was made for the church in Ghent, which is located in Belgium. It was one of those really prominent and dominant cities that we just talked about in as part of the Burgundy region. You'll notice something interesting about this starred slide, that I have two style, period, and cultures listed. This is kind of a difficult slide for me. I really couldn't decide what to list. Your textbook lists this as a continuation of the International Gothic style. And yes, I certainly understand why they did that for, to a certain extent. However, most other textbooks and most art historians call Jan van Eyck the father of the Northern Early Renaissance, and hopefully you'll see why when we cover this piece in more detail, or we look at more details of this piece. So I guess you guys are interested in what you need to know for the test, right? What you're going to be tested on. So you're going to need to give me Jan van Eyck, or just van Eyck. His last name is fine. Ghent altarpiece is suitable. You don't need to know that this is closed. Just be aware that there's more to it that we're going to see in the next slide. And then you can either give me International Gothic style, or you can give me the Northern Early Renaissance. Honestly, I'll let you guys go with each one, but maybe somewhere in your significance you can talk about why this is kind of representational of either or both, I guess you could say. Okay, so what are some characteristics of the International Gothic style or the Northern Early Renaissance that we're looking at here? Same as the International Gothic style, you can see that the figures are far too big for their architectural background. He's using intuitive perspective, actually a little bit better than some of the other artists that we've studied. The Northern artists, these artists outside of Italy, have absolutely no interest in recreating the accurate costumes for the story. So when we looked at, for example, the work of Giotto, when we looked at his lamentation scene, we saw that the people, he tried to render the people wearing togas and other sort of more accurate clothing for the time of Christ's actual death. Whereas in Jan van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece, he places his characters in contemporary dress. This kind of goes hand in hand with the well, I guess you could call it the International Gothic style's interest in fashion and clothing and sumptuous material, right? They want to show their fashion, they want to show their style, and they want to show their clothes and what they're wearing. And so instead of looking into what Mary actually would have worn, he puts Mary in what would have been an actually very typical house dress that one of these women in Burgundy would have worn on a sort of average day when she was hanging out inside her house. The setting itself, if you look at the background, this is not supposed to be Nazareth or anywhere in modern day Israel, or at the time where Jesus used to hang out. This is supposed to be Ghent, Belgium. So he's depicting this Annunciation scene taking place in Belgium, which everyone in Belgium knew that that's not where it happened. But again, they're just not interested in the realism that the Italians were interested in. They want to take the story, but they want to put it in their own setting and with their own context and in their own costumes. Okay, so that's another aspect of the International Gothic style. We also see those signs and symbols that we're used to seeing. Where's a good sign or symbol? Right here. This is a empty pot, which is standing for, it's kind of weird, but it's standing for it's an empty vessel that's standing for Mary's empty uterus, into which the child is going to be placed. And you think that I'm making this up, but I'm not making it up. You'll see lots of these pots around these Annunciation scenes, and they are supposed to be symbolism. Similar to Simone Martini's Annunciation, we have the angel Gabriel here. We have the presence of a lily, again for purity. And we have the Ave Maria words coming out of his mouth and going to Mary. Down here below, we have these two statues of saints. It's John the Baptist and John the Evangelist. So this is John the Baptist. He always has a beard. In this case, he has a sheep. He was also a shepherd. And then this is John the Evangelist. He's the guy who was in charge of one of the guys who was in charge of writing the Book of John. So the two Johns. And then on either side here, we have the donors. Now, these are the people who paid for this altarpiece, and it's a huge altarpiece, by the way. It's at least 11 feet tall. It may be a little bit taller than that. I'm sorry, I don't have that in my notes. So these are the donors kneeling in prayer. And again, we see this sort of separation of holy and sacred space. The donors are outside in their own sort of architectural frames, and they can kind of witness the statues, and maybe they can look up and see some of the vision, but they're not part of it. They're not in the holy space. They're experiencing this as a vision, not as an actual event that's occurring in front of them. So they just want to make sure that they're really clear about that. Oh, if you read in your book, this Jan van Eyck painted this with the assistance of his brother. Jan van Eyck usually just gets all of the credit, so I'm not going to make you memorize his brother's name. In fact, I couldn't tell you it. I don't even remember what his name is. Oh, up here, these are Old Testament prophets. You don't need to worry about them. I don't have time to get into all of their different stories, but they're foretelling the coming of Christ. This is the outside of it, and this is what the altarpiece would have looked like for the majority of the Sunday or other day services that an average church goer would have witnessed. But on special occasions, on feast days, and during the raising of the host, which we'll cover in just a second, they would open this altarpiece, and so they would only open on these special occasions. So it would have been a really momentous event, and Jan van Eyck commemorates this momentous opening with one of the most outrageously iconic Catholic statements that has ever been made. Okay. If you are not a member of the Catholic Church, then you may never have heard of the Eucharist. If you have, you can skip this part. The Eucharist is it's the time during church services when everyone gets a cracker. It's a symbolic reference to the Last Supper. During the Last Supper, when Christ is surrounded by his followers, he tells them to have a little bread and have a little wine, and he says that, I'm going to die tomorrow, guys, but don't worry, have this snack and think of me. And so, and I will be one, I'll become one with you. And the bread is my flesh and the wine is my blood, and I'll always be with you, basically. And so that was considered to be the first Eucharist. And so every Sunday during Catholic church services, the priest gets up, he raises some bread and he raises some wine. He says a little prayer, and it transforms the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, and everyone comes up and has a little piece of Christ. When I explained this practice to some transfer students, like from very far away, who were not familiar with the Christian tradition, they were very freaked out. Yes, it really was supposed to literally transform into the body and blood of Christ. Nowadays, many Christian sects, in fact, even Catholicism, has started to maybe ease up a little bit on, believing that it's literally body and blood, and most of them now say it's more symbolic. But at the time, there was no questioning the sincerity of it. It was body, and it was blood, and it was magic, and it did protect you. So anyway, that's the Eucharist. And we're looking here at a symbol or statement for this Eucharist. This is all about sacrifice and salvation. That's the main theme on the interior of Jan van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece. Again, I might put either of these pictures on the test, the altarpiece closed or the altarpiece open. If I'm nice, I'll try to cram both of them on there. But you can speak about the closed section, the Annunciation, and you can speak about the open section. It doesn't really matter what picture I put on, as long as you can identify it. And I'm not asking that you memorize that this is called the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb. Just the Ghent altarpiece is fine. Ghent altarpiece, Jan van Eyck, and then International Gothic or Northern Early Renaissance, whatever you want to call it, that's fine. Here you can see these hinges. These are the hinges of the polyptych where it would close. over the central panel and then open back up. Okay, signs of sacrifice and salvation. That's what I was talking about. Here in the central panel, you might expect this to be a figure of Christ, but in fact, it is not. This is supposed to be a representation of God the Father, and he is seated with an empty crown at his foot, and this is the empty crown that's waiting for Christ. So it's the crown. He sends his son down to earth, and the son gets to come back after he dies, and then he gets to wear this crown. But it's seated at his foot as he waits for the sacrifice. Over here we've got John the Baptist again, big bushy beard, and over on this side we have Mary, rendered in this very fashionable, right? Again, international style, very interested in fashion and expensive materials of her dress and of her crown and that kind of thing. But we'll get into that in just a moment. On either side, we have angels playing instruments, and keeping with the international Gothic style's disinterest in historical accuracy. These are, in fact, not instruments that would have been played during Christ's lifetime, but they are instruments that are contemporary to 1432 in Belgium. So these are some musical instruments that they would have been played, although up here they're being played by angels. And then on either side we have Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, if you're not familiar, are the creators of original sin. They are the original sinners. And then up in the top, we have more of this original sinning going on. We've got Cain killing Abel, etc. So, if you are familiar, however, with the book of Revelations, when Christ comes down and he kills everybody basically, and he picks people to go to heaven and then other people go to hell. Christ does go down and he saves Adam and Eve and he brings them up to heaven. So these were original sinners. You see Eve here even holding the apple, and they get pulled up to heaven. Their punishment for eating the apple that they weren't supposed to eat is kind of interesting. Adam's punishment was that he was supposed to work in the land, so you can see that he's all muscly, and he even has kind of a farmer's tan, right? You see his hands are much more tan, and his feet than the rest of his, and his face compared to the rest of his body, because he's been out in working in the fields. Mary's punishment is that she has to have painful childbirth, and so she's kind of represented as being pregnant. Not that she's supposed to be pregnant, just kind of a symbol of her punishment for getting kicked out. These two figures here are kind of why Jan van Eyck gets this reputation for being the first Northern Early Renaissance artist, because they're really not in an unbelievable S-curve, right? They're not standing in any kind of crazy position. They're not really in contrapposto, right? This is not one leg bent. These are both legs straight. But the proportions are pretty good. And there's even some attention to things like anatomy in the muscles of Adam's body. This rendition of Adam would almost be at home in early Renaissance Italy. And so that's one of the reasons why a lot of art historians call him the Northern Early Renaissance painter instead of the International Gothic, because he's not hiding his figures completely behind his clothes, but he's using some of this sculptural modeling that we saw Giotto use, and he's using some attention to proportions, which is really big for the Italian Renaissance. Back to the theme of sacrifice and salvation. Down here in the lower panels, we have the actual adoration of the mystic lamb, which is where this interior of the altarpiece gets its name. Here's the mystic lamb. Mystic lambs, or lambs, iconographically speaking, in Christian artwork, lambs can either stand for the flock and Christ is the shepherd. You see that a lot. Christ is the shepherd, lambs are his flock, the church followers, and he's leading them to salvation. A lamb, however, because lambs were used for sacrifices, can also be representative of Jesus himself. That's what's happening here. This is Jesus. And this is why there's no one in this crown, because Jesus is busy. He's down here being sacrificed. You have the cross here on one side, surrounded by angels. Everyone is up here adoring this mystical sacrifice. Is this the actual crucifixion as is happening? Absolutely not. That's not what he's trying to show. But he is showing the sacrifice, and in a interesting painterly illusionistic way, he's showing reference to the validity of the Eucharist. So if you imagine this lamb here, he's just been wounded. If you could see a detail, he's spilling blood into this little chalice right here. The blood would drip from his sacrifice off of the altar and collect down here into this illusionistic painted pipe. And this illusionistic painted pipe would filter down into this well. And then if you look down here at the bottom of the well, there's a spigot and a little ditch that runs off the canvas. This is significant when you understand that right below the altarpiece would have been the table where they kept the wine and the blood for the Eucharist. So symbolically, or not even symbolically, well, I guess technically symbolically, the blood is running from the lamb straight out of the canvas and into the cup. Now, don't be confused. This is all painted. I had a student once saying that there was a spigot that actually spewed blood from the canvas itself. No, that is not what I'm saying. Please be very clear. This is all illusion painting that he's doing. But you guys get the symbolic reference. Blood flows out, the validity of the Eucharist, Catholicism, all that good stuff. Another reason why Jan van Eyck gets the reputation of being the first Northern early Renaissance painter is because of all the meticulous detail that we've seen in other international Gothic style paintings. Jan van Eyck is the best. He is the most superior. So we're going to look right now at a detail of this crown right here. Let's check it out. Wow. Right? I mean, this is the reaction that I get when I teach this class in person. People are usually blown away by this detail. Of the crown, of the meticulous, the meticulous detail and the rendering of the gold, of the beads, of the gems, of the pearls, of the gems. You can see that there's an inscription down here, and it's not just a regular inscription. This is supposed to be a 3D looking carved inscription. It takes a lot of time. Even you can kind of see a little bit of the hem of God's robe, and this is where that materialistic quality of the International Gothic style is still clinging, right? They still want to see lots of wealth, especially on their religious figures. And there's actually something written on the hem of his robe, and I apologize, I don't know what that is. I wish I did. How is it that that Jan van Eyck is able to create such specific attention to detail within his canvas when the Italians show really no interest in it? Well, it has everything to do with the material that Jan van Eyck is using. Jan van Eyck is perfecting the use of oil painting. Oil painting had been around for some time, but it never really caught on in Italy. In Italy, they like to use frescoes or encaustic tempera. Encaustic paints, which is a wax-based paint. Oil paints, however, are going to be very popular in the north, thanks to, in part to Jan van Eyck. When we covered the fresco painting, we talked about how it was a very quick medium. We talked about the giornata, or the daily working time that an artist, the amount that an artist could complete in a day. Tempera, fresco painting dries very quickly. They don't have a lot of time. They do one section and then they do another section. Oil paints, because it's an oil-based medium, they take forever to dry. If you ever have worked with oil paints, then you know what I'm saying. You'll paint something and you'll come back a week later and it will still be tacky, and you try to paint over it and it will just kind of mush into your paint. It takes forever to dry. So you can paint one section, paint another section, come back and touch up the section that you painted earlier. You can add shadows. You can change areas where the light source is. You can build up layers of color by letting it dry, coming back and repainting. You can also very easily fix mistakes by scraping the paint off and reapplying another layer. Oil paints are great for that. They're hard to work with. They do take a long time to dry, but because they take a long time to dry, you can get this kind of built up levels and layers of color to make things look really realistic. Oil paints have a natural sheen to them, or shine, which builds on this whole sort of shiny stained glass materiality of the International Gothic style. So it's their best way of capturing some of this sort of light reflective properties of stained glass, in this case oil paint. So it's oil on wood, I should say. He's using oil on wood. And he was one of the first ones to use it. So you would definitely want to mention that if this shows up on your exam. You can see the beads here. They're not just white. It's not just a white pearl, but it's white where the light is hitting it, and then kind of grayish silver behind it. And then back here, where it's reflected, light from this bead is reflecting onto it, it's white again. And people love this. I mean, I hope that you get as much enjoyment from it as I do. It's so meticulous and it's so well done. And this is the realisticness of his still life and the attempt at creating the body is why he's considered to be the first Northern early Renaissance artist. But again, you can call him International Gothic if you wish, because that's what your textbook calls him. So we talked about oil painting and we talked about the Eucharist. I think we can feasibly move on from Jan van Eyck. Hopefully I didn't forget to mention anything. This is a hugely important piece. Oh, I know what I wanted to mention about it. It was stolen by Nazis during World War II. Because it is such an important work. Hitler wanted it really badly, and so they stole it, even though they technically didn't really invade Belgium. They just kind of went through Belgium. They stole this piece. They said it was for their quote-unquote protection. And it was, however, returned after World War II. They found it in a mine. If anyone saw Monuments Men, it's a cool movie. But that part of it is definitely true. They found it in a mine. They made it a little bit more dramatic in the movie. Also down here, it's signed. So if you can read Van Eyck, if this shows up on a test, don't get it wrong, because it's signed right here. You gotta love works that are signed. Makes it easier for you guys. Oh, this is a copy of it. When I went to go see this in person, there was a tour guide in front of it, and I couldn't get a good look. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, I know that it was supposed to be shiny because it's oil paint, but I didn't think it was supposed to be that shiny and smooth. And I finally got up close and I realized that this is a poster reproduction of the Ghent altarpiece. But you can kind of get a sense for scale here. The real Ghent altarpiece was behind the church, and you had to pay to get in because that's how they get you. Most things that are in churches are free to go see, which is great when you go to Europe. This is a portrait of a man in a turban. We're going to see the emergence of portraiture as a really major income source for artists, especially in the North because of the growing middle class. But in this case, we actually think this might be Jan van Eyck, because it's not necessarily a very flattering picture, and artists tend to be very self-deprecating in their own self-portraits, as opposed to when they paint patrons, they tend to be very flattering. And you can see here that Van Eyck has what we think is Van Eyck has some facial stubble. He's wearing a turban, which people didn't wear back then. They think that he's kind of covered his head in this, one of these sort of fabric cloths that he would have had in his studio to study fabric, right, for his still life training. Also, it says, when he, up at the top, it says, as I can. So, as I can, for example, maybe not as I would. And then on the bottom it says, Van Eyck made me, which is kind of interesting. He made me. Does not say that he painted me. It says he made me, which is kind of interesting. Let's talk about Roger van der Weyden. You can see a really major Roger van der Weyden work at the PMA, which we talked about during our introduction lecture. This is another work by him called A Deposition. So this is a removal of Christ from the cross. We've seen it a couple of times. Christ here is being lowered from this cross. It would have been an altarpiece. I'm not sure if it would have originally been a polyptych or not. We only have this central panel of it surviving. It was made by Roger van der Weyden for a donation to the official Church of the Archers Guild. So these are supposed to be references to crossbows up in the corner, because it's for the Archers Guild. Christ is dead. He's being taken down off of the cross. Mary is so upset by what she's seeing that she swoons, and Roger van der Weyden very ingeniously mimics the curve of these two bodies. Mary is swooned so dramatically that she's actually paler than the Christ figure right here. I don't really want to talk about this for too long because I'm, again, getting kind of off topic. But I do want to discuss, let's see, um, how these northern, or just stress, I guess, or reiterate how these northern Renaissance artists are not trying to place us in the scene, right? This is not trying to be a representation of the deposition as it would have happened historically. Roger van der Weyden is painting characters wearing costumes that people would have worn at the time, not costumes that they would have worn during Christ's life, especially this guy's costume. No one dressed like that in ancient Roman days. And he's not even setting, in this case, the scene in a naturalistic landscape. You see this gold background. It looks like a gold wall or room. It almost looks like the setting of scenery, as if what we're looking at here is a recreation of the deposition and not a deposition itself. Kind of like if you've ever gone and seen a nativity scene where everyone kind of stands the way that they think it's supposed to look, but it's not real. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. Again, attention to sumptuous materials like this guy's clothes, and then the gold leaf of the background that he's using, but very lovely and naturalistically rendered still life. And what I mean by that is the fabric in this case, and things like the skull and that kind of thing. Very, very well done. Roger van der Weyden also dabbled in portraiture. Again, everyone is going to need to start to learn a little bit of portraiture to make a little extra money. And so this is his portrait of a lady. Again, with this really, really high forehead. Just want to point that out. They really love these high foreheads. And she's has her hands clasped in prayer. So she's a good girl, but she also has a lot of jewelry on as well. Roger van der Weyden really enjoyed painting scenes of St. Luke drawing the Virgin. St. Luke is the patron saint of painters. If you're familiar with the story of St. Luke was given a vision of, even though he hadn't met them yet, he was granted a vision of Mary and Christ while he was a baby, while Christ was a child, and he drew that vision. And so he was the only person to ever sort of capture the image of Mary and Christ during their life. So, as the official painter of Mary and Jesus, he becomes the official patron saint of all painters. Other art historians have noted that the St. Luke in this image actually looks a lot like Roger van der Weyden, so you have that going on. Mary nursing the Virgin Christ in a Burgundian 15th century setting, right? Again, we're not looking at a accurate historical setting. And I love the inclusion of these two characters back here. Are we looking at a vision that these two characters are discussing? It's really unclear. And it's kind of cool that it leaves a lot to sort of guess at in that sense. Yeah. But again, excellent painterly detail. Not quite, I would argue, not quite to the level of Jan van Eyck, but certainly very impressive. This is our next start slide. It's attributed, this is a little bit dicey, it's attributed to the workshop of the master of Flamel. It's a city named Flamel. There was this artist who we don't actually know his name, but we call him the Master of Flamel. And art connoisseurs have looked at this piece and determined that this particular masterpiece probably came from that workshop, although we don't actually know if the Master of Flamel actually touched it. So it might have been done by a bunch of his apprentices, and maybe he only came up with the plans, or maybe he drew the figures and nothing else. We're not exactly sure. So the artist for this one is a little bit dicey. If you want to kind of skip the artist when you study, I wouldn't be mad. It's not that important. But I do want you to know that this is the Merode altarpiece, and I do want you to know that it's either International Gothic style or Northern Early Renaissance. You can call it either or. Should really be a review for you guys at this point, but of what stylistically places this piece in the International Gothic or early Northern Renaissance style. Figures too large for the rooms that they're standing in. the rooms are adhering to this intuitive perspective, a not naturalistic or realistic rendering of three-dimensional space. You can see, oh, this is a really good example right here of this table. We're looking at the top of the table at the same time as we're looking at the side of the table. And that does not happen in nature. That's not how our eyes work. You look at the table either from the top or from the side, depending on where our eyes are in relation to the horizon line. But that doesn't really matter for intuitive perspective. They don't really care about that. This bench also reaches very, very dramatically off to the side. The setting that we're looking at, again, is not an accurate historical setting for the time period of the Annunciation, but, Mary's actually wearing the same kind of dress that she's wearing in the Annunciation scene on Jan van Eyck's altarpiece. She's wearing this sort of long-sleeved house dress that women would have worn in Burgundy in the 15th century. She's not as rich as we've seen some of these Marys and Annunciation scenes, but she's certainly not poor. And there are still lots of these anachronisms or sort of, things that don't really belong there. For example, the book that she's reading, it would not have been a book, it would have been a scroll. And the architecture itself belongs to Burgundy in the 15th century. This is a typical Burgundian living room, basically. Another aspect or characteristic of this International Gothic early Northern Renaissance style, symbolism. This piece has a lot more symbolism than we're even used to. We've got this empty vessel. We're used to that. We're used to the lilies right here. Also, I think I forgot to mention this in the Jan van Eyck altarpiece, but these instruments over here, this is a tzalit, which is a Jewish prayer shawl. So just a reminder that before all of this Jesus stuff happened, Mary and her husband Joseph were Jews. Joseph over here, interesting inclusion of Joseph. We don't see him that often, but Joseph was Mary's husband, but not Jesus' father, right? Okay. He's over here building a mousetrap. And that's another symbolic reference, another interesting symbolic reference, because Christ is supposed to be the bait that catches the devil, who's the mouse. So the fact that he's building a mousetrap is not an accident. And then outside the window behind him, you see the streets of a typical Burgundian town. That's what we see. Over on this side, you have the patron and his wife. We think his wife was added later. So either he had a different wife and he remarried and he repainted her, or when he commissioned this, he wasn't married and then he wanted to put his wife in afterwards. So that's why she looks kind of awkward and off to the side. Meticulous attention to detail, yes. A little bit more of this sculptural modeling. You can see things like her knees, although for the most part her body's buried completely behind these robes, so we really can't see, as we did in the Adam and Eve from the Jan van Eyck Ghent altarpiece. We really can't see if he has true human proportions or study of anatomy or anything like that, because everyone's just wearing too many clothes. I guess the last thing I wanted to mention in this piece is the final part of this Annunciation puzzle, and that's coming right in through this window. We've seen Annunciation scenes, and most of them, there's a Holy Spirit coming down out of heaven to impregnate Mary. But in this workshop of the Master Flamel, very, very interestingly rendered, instead of using a dove, plant himself in the uterus, and Mary will be pregnant. And he's carrying a little cross too, a symbol of his sacrifice. I just love that. It's so small when you see it in person. This Merode altarpiece is a little bit under 3 feet tall, and maybe between 4 and 5 feet wide. So it's quite small, and my husband, when he was trying to get a picture of this, because it's also in the cloisters in the Met, so you can go see it in person, we got yelled at a couple of times because he was getting a little close to the canvas, and I said, "Don't worry, I'm watching him. I'm an art historian," but they still were not happy with us trying to get a really, really close-up picture of this amount of detail. So yes, rendering of detail, very, very important for the International Gothic style, and only possible because, again, similar to Van Eyck, the workshop of the Master Flamel is using oil paint. Another of Van Eyck's famous works, he's well known, most well known probably for the Ghent altarpiece, but this one is comes a very, very close second for his most famous work, and it was done later in his life. It's a double portrait of Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife. So, portrait of Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife. It's oil again, so we're looking at oil paint. It's pretty small. I believe it's under 4 feet tall, although I unfortunately did not have the opportunity to see this one in person. Don't be fooled by the name Giovanni Arnolfini. Yes, the patron in this painting was Italian, but he was living in Burgundy and working in Burgundy, and he was getting married to a Burgundian woman. So there had this commissioned painting to celebrate their union, to celebrate their marriage. Unlike an actual wedding, though, the scene is not actually taking place in a church. So this is more of a sort of symbolic reference to their wedding than actually trying to capture what the wedding looked like. This is not Jan van Eyck's attempt at being a wedding portrait artist. It's more of a symbol of their wedding, because they're having this symbolic wedding in the bedroom, which is not where people would have gotten married. They would have gotten married in church, especially not someone who's as wealthy as Giovanni Arnolfini. How can we tell he's wealthy? Well, just look at that great hat and that amazing fur coat that he's wearing. Back in the 15th century in Flanders, there were limitations set on what people of different class systems could wear. Only people in really, really high classes could wear things like the most expensive imported silk or furs. And so you know that he has worked his way up in society because he's a very, very successful, I believe he was a merchant, although he might have been a banker. I'm sorry, I forget which one we're looking at. We can tell exactly what kind of fur it is, not me. Other people can tell exactly what kind of fur it is because of the meticulous detail that Jan van Eyck is extending to his work. Again, we also have, well, it's kind of hard to tell, but the intuitive perspective, right? The perspective just seems a little wonky, although it's actually getting a lot better. Again, though, this is Jan van Eyck we're talking about, and so he is really the best of the Northern Renaissance painters as far as, getting really close to a Renaissance level of mastery of things like perspective and proportions. And actually, you could argue that he's better because he can get more detail in his paintings than the Italians could. He also follows, though, with his Northern Early Renaissance interest in symbolism, lots of symbolism. You guys are probably already sitting there thinking to yourself, okay, a dog. So we're going to see some fidelity happening in this wedding. These shoes here that have been kicked off, actually, both of these pairs of shoes that have been kicked off are references to the Old Testament story of Moses before the burning bush, where he's told to remove his shoes because he's on holy land. So they're on this holy ground witnessing a holy union or a holy marriage is what we're looking at. These over here on the table, I've heard them explained as both apples and oranges, and we're not sure which one. If they're apples, they're standing for original sin. If they're oranges, they're standing for health. And it might even be sort of purposefully ambiguous that Van Eyck is sort of leaving them to our interpretation. Other symbol in here, we've got this one candle standing in for the one true God. And then a cross up here in the window that's formed almost accidentally, right? But we know that this is not an accident. There's never really an accidental cross anymore. And now we're going to look at really the most impressive of Jan van Eyck's work. And that's this very, very small detail down here in the back. This little square right here. We're going to look at a detail. Yes, this is a detail from that same small painting, and this is an even smaller rendition, or a smaller, what we would call a miniature within the painting, right below his signature. In the Northern Renaissance, Northern Early Renaissance, and the Northern High Renaissance, which we'll get to a little bit later, they love to use things like convex mirrors because it helps them extend their picture plane beyond the frame of the square that we're looking at. So this is a convex mirror. It's a rounded mirror, like a fisheye lens, but in the back, and so it's showing a reflection of the back of the scene that we see. So here's Giovanni Arnolfini, the back of him. You can see his wonderful hat and his lovely clothes. And here's the back of his blushing bride. Interesting that we do not see Jan van Eyck, which is who we would expect to see right here, right? Because he's painting the portrait. Instead of Jan van Eyck, this would have been the priest officiating the wedding and his helper. So he's really creating this illusion that we're looking at a wedding and keeping himself out of it. Down here around the border, we have scenes from the Passion of the Christ, Passion and Crucifixion of the Christ. These are cracks in the wall, not not cracks in the oil paint, but cracks that he's painted in the wall, because the wall would not have been perfect. It would have had sort of dips and cracks in the plaster, and so that's what you see here. These are beads of a rosary. Again, just so well done. They're see-through and they're clear, but you can still see that they're round and they reflect on the wall, right? This is their reflection from the light running through them. It's just outstanding. And then again, he signs it. Johannes van Eyck fuit hic, which says Jan van Eyck was here. Again, he's not actually saying I'm painting this. He just says he was here. And then 1436, I believe. So 1434. So this used to be starred, and students would really like it because they could kind of see it, but not everyone can make that out. Anyway, we're not exactly sure what we're looking at here because apparently Giovanni Arnolfini did not get married until 1447. So the actual marriage didn't take place until after Van Eyck's death. And after this painting was created, actually, obviously. So we might actually be looking at a betrothal painting, sort of a symbolic reference for a future wedding, or maybe it was his first wife and we don't know anything about her. We're not exactly sure what we're looking at. Other portraits, other portrait artists include Petrus Christus, who painted this, a goldsmith in his shop. Again, and I just really want to hit this home, portraiture was really important in the North, in this sort of merchant's time of the self-made man, because people could have, wealthy or high expensive shops, and they can come from nothing, and because of their reputation, because of their skill, because of their trade, they could become very, very wealthy, and that's really what counted. So Petrus Christus is painting this portrait of a goldsmith to hang in the goldsmith's shop. So in the North, yes, they're interested in the self-made man, but they're really not interested in exact portraiture. It really doesn't matter what their faces look like. It doesn't really matter that this guy's eyes are kind of shallow or off-centered. It didn't really matter, if you go back a couple slides, that Giovanni Arnolfini had that really large, way too large head. It was more about what else is in the picture besides the face. They're not interested in accurately rendering the facial or what they look like. It's more about what's going on in his shop. So advertising what a good goldsmith he is. Back behind him, these are some vessels and incense burners that he would have been, candles. Or sorry, not candles, chalices that he would have been creating for church commission. So he's such a good goldsmith, and he's also religious, and he gets commissions from churches. This is coral, which they would have used in jewelry. Glass, they would have used in jewelry. A couple of gems down here. These are some other rings. So all of the sort of the tricks of, and these beads strung up along the side. All the sort of tricks of the accessories that a goldsmith would need to have in his shop. The goldsmith himself, you can see, caters to not just a church population, but also a very, very wealthy patronage. You see, these two people that are here to see him are very, very wealthy individuals. They're dressed very nice and sort of in the height of fashion. Again, material, being able to capture this sort of material that they're wearing was really important, because you could tell how rich they were by what type of material they were carrying. These two are picking out an engagement ring. So they're at the goldsmith buying an engagement ring. It's always a very tense moment for a husband. You can see right here, he wants to make sure he's not getting swindled. He's got one hand on his sword. But everything's going to be okay. His scales are just and true. He's measuring the exact weight of the ring versus the amount of money, and then charging his, goldsmith commission for actually having turned it into a ring. Elsewhere on the table, you see three different currencies. So he does trade all over all over their known world. So there's actually some currency from Florence there as well. So he's doing a lot of trade with foreign people as well. His shop is so popular that Petrus Christus is using once again this convex mirror to show people waiting in line outside his shop. So these are two men waiting outside his shop. One of them has a falcon, which is cool. Hans Memling was another important artist. A portrait artist. These artists, it's kind of interesting. They would create these workshops where they would produce a lot of one-winged pictures of Mary and the Christ child. And then you would go in and you would pick which one you wanted, and then you would sit for your portrait, and then they would paint the other half. So for this one of Martin van Nieuwenhove, this should be a van, not a can. Sorry, guys. He would have gone into the shop, picked this image of Mary, and then had himself painted as the opposite side. This is a diptych, and it's relatively small, sort of private diptych. They wanted to make sure that they had really big things for very wealthy people, but they also wanted to have some things for the middle class, and even some things for the lower middle class, which we'll see in just a second. This is coming out of the French court. I love this. Jean Fouquet's Etienne Chevalier and Saint Stephen with the Virgin and Child. It's just so saucy. Etienne Chevalier, right here, was one of the sort of advisors to the king, and it said that he was in love with the queen at the time, so in love with her that after she died, her name was Agnes Sorel. Sorry, she was the mistress of the king, I should say, not the queen, but the mistress. It said that after she died, he commissioned this piece, and he asked Jean Fouquet to make Mary look like Agnes. So we're certainly not looking at a Mary that's supposed to be the Mary who gave birth in a barn. We're looking at a French mistress, expensive mistress, very, very wealthy mistress, who is wearing all of the trappings of French fashion, including her very, very high forehead, her crown, her gauze material that comes down from her crown, and some gratuitous boob, because we've seen nursing virgins before, but they're always actually nursing. And in this one, she's not. So, yeah. Might be a little bit less than appropriate, a little bit saucy, as I said. I also love how this little Jesus is like pointing back at him. Usually he'd be extending a blessing, but it's almost as if he's looking at him like, "Hey, you looking at my mom?" I don't know. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but anyway. So this is Etienne Chevalier in the red. Next to him is a representation of Saint Stephen. You can always tell a saint because they're always holding the accessories of their death. So Saint Stephen was stoned to death, so he's got a rock that he carts around, and if you look at the back of the head, he is bleeding from the rocks. He was stoned to death. So that's how you can tell it's Saint Stephen. And Etienne is French for Stephen, so that's why he's hanging out with Stephen. It's his namesake. I mentioned briefly that these artists wanted to make sure that they had something for every level of economic household. They wanted to have big things for really wealthy people. They wanted to have small portraits for, the middle class. And they also wanted to have something for the lower middle class. And that's where engravings and woodcuts became very, very popular. An engraving or woodcut, both of these are mediums that involve the carving of a plate into a stamp and then stamping that plate onto a piece of paper. What's really great about a carving or a woodcut or an engraving is you make one plate and you can make a whole bunch of stamps. So you don't have to worry about repainting the same scene over and over again. You just stamp it a couple more times. Let's talk technical differences here briefly. In a woodcut, a woodblock print, you take a block of wood and you carve everything away that you want to be white, leaving the raised section where you want there to be a line. So basically exactly like creating a stamp. Anything that's raised will collect ink, and that ink will spread to this paper. And that's really the most intuitive. You can see here, like these are the raised lines, and they're going to leave a stamp. Hard to make shading with a wood block, right? Because everything that stamps is the same color. You can't have different shades of like lighter black or gray or anything like that. An intaglio, or an engraving, is done in a metal plate, and a artist will take a burin, or a sort of V-shaped carving tool, and slice into the metal plate and carve away where they want there to be black lines. So you see that they carve these little V-shaped divots into the metal. Then they cover the whole thing in ink, then they wipe away the top layer. So you can see that the raised areas do not have ink, that there's ink sitting in these V's. Then when they stamp the paper, the ink gets absorbed into the paper. If you want, there's a video that I posted that does a much better job of illustrating how to make an engraving plate than I can. What's really nice about an engraving plate, if you're an artist, is that you make lines where you want there to be lines. Whereas in a wood block carving, you make lines where you want there to be white, which is not what we're used to, right? We make lines where we want them to be dark because that's how we learn how to paint, how to draw with pencils and that kind of thing. So, but I'll post that video. It'll do a much better job of explaining it. Martin Schongauer was one of these amazing engraving artists, and this is his engraving of St. Anthony tortured by demons. It's a really, really common scene to show. It's a temptation scene. They get visited by monsters, which is what you're seeing here. And they will sometimes turn, but in St. Anthony's case, you can tell that he's not going to turn because he's got, despite all this craziness going on around him, he's got this very pacified expression on his face, so he's not going to turn. Engraving artists sign their work. The issue with engraving is it's really hard to make a curved line. The burin kind of wants to go straight. But you can get around this by kind of making several small lines or putting the engraving plate on a penny and rotating the plate around. And what's really great about an engraving is that you, the deeper your line is that you carve, the more ink it will hold, and so the darker that line will be. And they can also create areas of really dark shadow by using something called cross-hatching. So if you look here at this amazing demon's anus, he creates these areas of really deep black by using some lines going that direction and some lines going that direction. So they cross, they hold a lot of ink, and it's much, much darker. Whereas in other areas, he just has these sort of linear shading. There's no blending in engravings or woodcuts. That's what you have to work with. Cross-hatching. So that's going to do it for my discussion of Chapter 19, 15th Century Art in Italy. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I especially hope you enjoyed this demon's butthole, for those of you who stuck around to the end. And I'll catch you guys with Chapter 20. We're going to go back to Italy in Chapter 20. So moving from Burgundy back down to Italy.